Yeah, welcome everyone. It's really exciting to be here. Glenn and I have been part of this conversation, which is the idea of what does university education look like in a land-based context? What does it look like in the North, and why is it, or could it be different? And so we wanted to frame tonight to be like a conversation. So when we're talking, if you have questions, bring them in, and we're going to kind of conversate in front of you about moving from sort of pie-in-the-sky concept into action. So we're going to take you up north of BC, Alberta, and Saskatchewan into the Northwest Territories, our Denendeh and the Nunavut settlement region. The Northwest Territories has 33 communities, 43,000 people. We have 11 official languages. I was born on Glenn's traditional territory. I'm settler origin, and we are sort of large and diverse, and post-contact, sort of a major focus on resource extraction is sort of the lay of the land.
Yeah, like Link introduced, I'm a Yellowknives Dene First Nation member, and the school that we'll be talking about is a university-based field school program, which is located on our traditional territory, which is Chief Drygee's territory. Chief Drygee's signed a treaty with the Crown in right of Canada with the Yellowknives Dene First Nation in 1900. So the site that we're working with is roughly, thank God I'm tall, just in between the communities of Deda, which is where I'm from, and Clutzel Cay, which is another neighboring community. So this is where the field school is located, just to kind of orient you geographically to where we're talking about. It also is important to note this location because in order to do a project like this well, so a university-based, land-based pedagogical sort of educational experience which values traditional knowledge, local knowledge bases, and emphasizes the importance of land-based activities in the context of educational self-determination. It's been very important for me as a YKDFN member to ensure that they have always been informed of and involved in the project itself. Now, that's not always an easy task to maintain those community relations, but as a community member and who's involved in this process, one of my underlying sort of and foremost ethical considerations was a respect for and recognition of the sovereignty of the YKDFN and Clutzel Cay, so the Acacial region.
In sort of the project of education and learning on sort of a bureaucratic level, you get really pounded with the statistics, which at first glance look very, very dire. Most Northerners, if they graduate high school, don't go on to post-secondary. You have sort of your stats are blurred at the bottom, but the Department of Education reports that 15.4% of Aboriginal people in the Northwest Territories hold a high school diploma, 25.1% hold other certificates and diplomas, and 4.6% hold university degrees. And so you have this gloss of statistics. And across the North for the last couple of years, there's been a lot of youth organizing around things like the Mackenzie Gas Pipeline, a lot of projects community-based around women's health and education. And as Deshinta started, we started asking a lot of questions about what's behind these statistics, and talking to Northern people who had gone to university and come home, people who had gone and dropped out, people who didn't go at all, and looking at the factors. So things like the financial cost of traveling back and forth. Glenn's going up to teach in Delaney on Friday, and his plane ticket was $2,000 return from Vancouver. So the cost of getting around, especially it's really important to be at home for certain events, funerals especially, weddings, and a lot of people talked about the sort of stretch of being away at school and still being able to support and participate in your community. And also the lack of support if you have kids. We have a lot of kids in our communities, and the struggle of being a student or a single parent student with 2 or 3 or more kids was a reason that came up over and over again as sort of central to people's experience of having to leave your community and to be alienated from where you come from in order to get a higher education.
So behind these statistics has also been a hesitancy among, in particular, First Nations or Indigenous students from the Northwest Territories. This hesitation coming from the legacy of educational projects in the North, not only in the North, but which I would argue are particularly pronounced in the North. And this legacy, of course, is the legacy left by the residential schooling system. So there's this understanding or this kind of anxiety that still exists about education still being ultimately a colonial project. So if you look at, for instance, historically, the residential school system was part of a larger project of dispossession. So stripping Indigenous peoples from their lands, hoarding them up in the residential schools as part of a project of remaking them into people that would be conducive to, or in a project that would be conducive to the expansion of a settlement, and in particular capitalist development in the Northwest Territories. So with this historical legacy, I think it's important to recognize its contemporary manifestation in the way in which education is run in the North. So part of the problem, which a number of studies have pointed out, is that although the kind of at least explicitly racist veneer of that process or that colonial project of A, stripping people from their lands, and B, creating a context conducive to a certain specific form of economic development is very much still the educational project that has started from early grade school years up through the post-secondary education institutions that are available, or programs that are available. So in particular, there's an emphasis on any sort of post-secondary education in the Northwest Territories tends to be emphasized, and this is not entirely the case, but tends to be emphasized around the fulfillment of and creation of jobs and employment in the non-renewable resource sector. So if you look at it in the context of this colonial sort of context, it is very much doing the same thing. It is still working over, in particular, Indigenous, but also non-Indigenous student base into a context where that would fulfill the needs of capitalist expansion in the Northwest Territories. So one, unfortunately, you can't see this very well, but one of the quotes that came out from a recent study is very much that any post-secondary educational initiatives that are going on in the Northwest Territories have taken on this sort of technical school aspects, which is supposed to fuel, basically produce in wage slaves in the non-renewable resource sector. So you have things like, well, I remember at one point I used to joke about this, but you get to learn how to polish diamonds is one of the post-secondary options or trade school initiatives that you could do in the Northwest Territories. The prime example of what we would call alienated labor. But outside of that, so if you want to take a course like to develop your critical sort of research and thinking skills in the humanities, in the arts, in a number of various ways, you can't do that in the North. You have to go south. And then it doubles back in and fuels the sort of the sense of alienation that the statistics actually formally get at. So the lack of financial support, the having to leave culture and community in order to pursue a higher education, the having to leave family, and so on and so forth. So if you look at it through this frame, it's still very much a question of colonial power and education's relationship to it.
And sort of given this lens of where education is at and this real promotion that, for example, when I was in high school, Imperial Oil came repeatedly to my high school and do really flashy presentations, and at the end there'd be, a young Aboriginal man standing in front of a red truck, and it would say, with only a grade 8 education, you can make $80,000 a year as a pipe fitter. And so from a very, very young age, it was very much promoted through school that this was a really good track to take with your education. And in counter to this has sort of been these ongoing voices articulating what it means to learn from the land, the idea that the land is your teacher. And from the Berger inquiry onwards, you have these testimonies of people re-articulating what it means to be educated. What does it mean to serve your community? What does it mean to be self-governing in terms of education? And so gathering people around the idea of if there was a Northern University program, what would it look like and what would define it? Sort of working out what would be a vision. And the vision is sort of, that came forward from a strategic working group, was that dynamic, sustainable, and self-determining communities where human capacity is rooted in indigenous knowledge and values, which seems sort of straightforward. But the mission then of Deshinta is to support a new generation of leaders and researchers by providing accessible and practical learning and development experiences that are respectful of traditional ways in a taiga bush environment. And moving forward with this sort of momentum with an advisory circle of people ranging from academics like Glenn to elders to leading Canadian research chairs in polar ecology, and sort of a broad sort of spectrum of people, it was surprising to see institutional reaction to the idea that university could possibly take place in a land-based format and still be recognized, still be quality, and still have meaning for students and for the academy. Sorry, everything is getting kind of squished and I'm not sure why. But the idea is that Deshinta is delivered in a taiga bush environment, and looking from examples from New Zealand to Hawaii to the Semi University, is that field schools or experiential learning has really high success rate. McGill does a field study program in Africa, and after 5 years of the program, they went back to hundreds of McGill graduates, and the people that had done the field studies in Africa program continuously noted that their transformational moment when they decided what to do with their lives and what the role of their degree was and in their education happened when they were on field study in Africa. So we're continuously seeing these really exciting results from field schools that exist already. For field schools or land-based experiential learning to offer a different space for development. So the idea is sort of a single university semester. It happens on the land, land-based opportunities for learning, and gives people sort of, puts them into an environment with teachers that are coming from different backgrounds. So the idea that it was a co-teaching model, that professors would join elders, would join leaders, would join community experts, and together that they would develop curriculum and teach students in a university-credited sort of space.
So to this end, what was eventually started was a gathering. We had a gathering when was the advisory board gathering?
2 years ago, March.
So a couple of years ago, March, of a number of important people that we thought would be involved with and had expressed interest in this type of project. Again, ranging from various Dene elders, people in positions of leadership, academics, and so on and so forth. And we had this kind of advisory board meeting, and at that point we started trying to think of what this might look like in practice. And what we came up with was a kind of, at that point, was just a rough idea of who was the players involved, who was interested and could be in a capacity to serve as instructors over this. And what we did is we set up kind of a rough go of course work, or a course-based, like courses that we would fill in a semester. And again, this would draw on a diversity of knowledge bases, not exclusively research in the quote sense or academic, that would develop a pretty broad, well-balanced sort of semester that would incorporate not only a more standard sort of course-based sort of environment, but also ones that would have the land serve as or land-based activities, particularly in terms of Dene traditional knowledge, informing that teaching experience at the same time. So the courses we developed, I believe, are in the next one. I served as a co-instructor with Stephanie Erlbacher-Fox on our Land, Our Life, Dene Self-Determination in Theory and Practice. And we also had two elders, Modeste and Therese, who were serving as co-instructors on this. And then Steph had a number of elders teaching as well. So what we had, our idea was, and I'm just going to tell you kind of my own experience teaching here, was our idea, like I deal with, I'm a political scientist who deals with questions of Indigenous self-determination, and a lot of my empirical focus is in the North. And it was on a history of our struggle for self-determination from roughly the post-war period to the 1990s. And during that period, we had the Berger Inquiry, which was our fight against a massive proposed pipeline cutting through our period. And then the emergence of the negotiation of land claims at this point. And we put forth a number of very innovative and critical proposals for what we thought the institutionalization of self-determination for us in the Northwest Territories would be. And they both amounted to a critique of capitalism and industrialization in the North, and also a critique of the bureaucratic straitjacket that northern forms of imposed governance were in relation to our own traditional forms. And over time I got to understand this through research, through listening to people, through a lot of reading, that this critique was fundamentally grounded in a unique and a place-based sort of consciousness that the Dene kept articulating in our criticisms of contemporary policy, whether it's in land claims or self-government. So you kept hearing this kind of discourse about how not only how significant the land is to us, but how significant the social relations that are encompassed by the land were for informing what we thought political relations would look like, or what we thought economic relations would look like. So you kept hearing this kind of land as, of course, identity and as a material means for which to subsist over time, but it was also this land as a kind of ethical relationship that informed what we thought good governance would look like, what we thought a good economic system would look like. And this was constantly expressed in public testimony at the Berger Inquiry and so on and so forth at a number of various different sites as kind of being the essence of what the land meant. And this was embodied in the practices that, traditional or otherwise, of being on the land, of the ethics of reciprocity are involved in human, non-human actions, in hunting, in fishing, in virtually everything that you did on the land. So what I did was this gave me an opportunity to kind of, for somebody who had grown up in the city for so long, who thought that I had a fairly strong conceptual grasp of this, to see if it actually played itself out in terms of the land-based activities on governance that we would do to supplement what we were learning with respect to Dene political history. And not surprisingly, but I was really hoping that this would happen, it was seamless. So we would be holding seminars, we'd be sitting around a fire and talking about Dene political history, and then on say in terms of proper decision-making practices in governance, one of the elders would step in, this time George, and start talking about how a traditional hunting camp in the actual place where we were would organize these sorts of decision-making processes and the ethics and so on behind it. And similarly with respect to what Steph was doing. So Steph, one of her projects was she was teaching about self-government, but it was integrated with moose hide tanning. And that as a social governance self-determining practice, which itself is supposed to, ideally, when this system was up and operating in its fullest, to inform decision-makings that you would be making in terms of governance, political relations, and so on. So this was kind of the integrative whole that at least I had an idea for, and it worked quite well in terms of at least the stuff on governance explicitly and in relation to these land-based activities.
And so Deshinta kind of moved forward with a pilot, trying to fundraise. Yes.
I'm just wondering if you could explain to people what reciprocity means and the ethics of that, because I'm not sure if non-Dene would understand what that means.
Yeah, well, there's a complex and then there's a more, well, for instance, one of the things that was just like in terms of our interactions out on the land in relation to some of the governance stuff that we were talking about was expressed in just quite a simple maxim, and that is anything that you take, you have to give back something. This gets translated into more social practices of an ethics of reciprocity, which means that essentially what the land means in this context is not something that's on your feet, but it's a relationship of mutual obligation that govern human and non-human actors over time in a given geographical location. So this would mean, for instance, well, it's like one elder that I know, or somebody that I talk to is like, it's better conceived of nidi, or land, is not conceived of that which is under your feet, but that which is, I guess it's better described in English as an ecosystem, but and the relationships within an ecosystem, but you have to strip the anthropocentric nature of that and understand that the obligations that you have to other actors in that transcend the human, non-human binary. So this would include obligations that are actually to the land as somebody who has to, or as something that has to be given ethical considerations when you go about acting about in terms of governance, in terms of your economy, and so on. So it's that reciprocal relationship that I argued, particularly pronounced in the 1960s, 70s, and into the early 80s, that actually got translated into our proposals for contemporary land claim. So one that would emphasize radical sustainability, not the co-opted sustainability that is all the rage right now. It would emphasize in terms of governance structures a consensus-based bottom-up sort of approach that recognized the autonomy of location and then trickled up in terms of when you conceptualize joint governance projects between regions with guaranteed Dene representation. And in terms of political economy, it meant fostering what was often referred to as the bush economy. So the sustainable, renewable resource-based economy that we had lived on for centuries, that being hunting, trapping, and fishing. Any sort of involvement that would happen in the non-renewable resource area would have to be done with that ethical sort of understanding of reciprocity in mind. So what we thought that might look like would be we would apply models of workplace democracy, like at the workplace. So democratic control of the workplace and democratic control over the scope of what we might decide to do in the non-renewable resource sector. And then we would take a guaranteed amount of money out of that and then fuel it back in to support the renewable traditional resource sector. So this was all like that rather complex contemporary articulation was rooted in these base forms of understanding reciprocity in terms of human, non-human relationships.
I think if we move with that idea of reciprocity being rooted, going into a space with a whole bunch of people from different regions, the elders had sort of directed that the first time we did this, that it would be Northern and Northern Indigenous students to try things out, so the elders could come together in that space, because there was the idea that some teachings are for some people at certain times and for others at different times. So this idea of how do you create a respectful teaching space where there's different experiences of decolonization happening, whether it's for Northern Aboriginal students or elders, or for international students, or for Northerners who are settlers like myself. And so a very sort of multi-layered environment, and bringing in lots of different people to teach from their own understanding of the sort of framework that was set out in terms of co-teaching and rooted in the land. And so Glenn's course started it off. We had Francois Paulette come, who, if you're reading, it's the Paulette from the Paulette case, and sort of take us through history and setting up sort of the tone of the space as being for healing and for wellness. And also incorporating into that responsibilities, both within the camp and within the group, and trying to organize sort of, how do you organize the work? Who's chopping the wood? Who's collecting berries? Who's helping Modeste to go and get what he needs in terms of plants for the tea that he needs every day? And sort of, organizing in that sense. So sort of learning on lots of different spaces, not just sit down around the fire, theoretical learning, but learning through lots of different spaces and lots of different people. But through this sort of process, we offered 3 credited courses, which we worked through the Department of Native Studies at the University of Alberta. And it's sort of this back and forth between all of the different people developing the courses to make a course outline that was acceptable to the university and that was acceptable to the premise of what we were trying to accomplish. So we ended up with the course that Glenn helped teach, and a writing and communications course. In the video, we show the students worked on a lot of pieces of the video. They had journalists come out from Native Communication Society and CBC, Richard Van Camp, who's a famed storyteller and novelist, and work on sort of the process of digesting the experience through writing, and digesting where people were coming from and where they were going through words, and sharing stories. And we did a First Peoples Community Health Promotion program, which was sort of this interesting curriculum piece that had been delivered in Nunavut and the Yukon, and was worked through with the Institute for Circumpolar Health Research to be sort of adapted into the Dashinta context. And this was sort of the curriculum piece that we ended up having the most challenges with, which I'll sort of talk about near the end. And we also developed a course around sustainable communities and strategies, really on this idea of radical sustainability, and sustainability based in an Dene ethic, and also in an Inuit ethic from a governance perspective. And we ended up offering just 3 days of a workshop, because there wasn't time in the sort of 3.5 weeks that we were out there to do a full course. So we moved forward with offering a summer semester pilot, and the idea was that if we could get everybody together, that we could kind of refine what we were doing, take it off the page and move it into actually being out in the space and out with each other, and to explore the site, to see what the content was like, and to have sort of feedback and evaluation, because the idea is that over time that we can work with students and their families to see what impact this had, that the students can have impact in developing more curriculum and setting the design for what happens next time, and to clarify really what are the long-term goals of this idea of a land-based university. Lynn, can you help us with this? I'm actually going to stop it because I know that it's not going to... Link, can you help us do the video on the outside part? For the video? It has to sweep in.
So this is the video that, the people who came out from the Native Communications Association came and worked with some of the students in terms of media savvy and this sort of stuff. And they came up, and the students would be taught and learn interviewing techniques and so forth. But also, in the end, this became the end product. And it's a kind of a run-through of student experiences, and just a kind of a crash sort of mini like 7-minute doc where they get to express the significance of this learning experience to them. So this is what you're about to see. It's like 6 minutes.
There's a different way of teaching and learning that another school couldn't do. So the land is become the teacher.
This aspect, or this week of to be self-determining in the field of education means that you have options. So I would hope that this program, Deshinta, really kind of fosters that openness and a more robust kind of approach to education in the North.
I'm enjoying it quite a bit, and I'm learning a lot more than I had thought.
It's been amazing because I'm used to learning it within an institution, and so we've taken it out of that and put it into a camp, and I'm finding it like moving and empowering.
For the future of the North to be a strong one, you need to have a really strong education base.
I believe that knowing your history gives you way more confidence in who you are, and then you're able to know where you're going.
Well, it is very important to the people up here, especially with the whole self-government in Vetrico right now, and things are moving in the right direction, but they're going at a much slower pace, and I think they need some of the youth in the area to get more involved with politics, to take the reins, I guess, start paddling the canoe.
Well, first of all, living in the bush and not being able to just be disturbed by all the city life and being into your routine, being out here really helps that. You can think more, and especially with the elders here, they teach you basic stuff like fishing and cleaning up the fish and smoking it and respecting the land, especially the respect of the land.
I think it's very important to have elders in any type of gathering that you have that involves Indigenous teachings. They're the ones that know all the stories and know the land, and they're the ones that keep that information, and it's important for them to be involved in our communities in a big way.
Sometimes we leave the hide on and it keeps the meat fresh.
But I think all of us feel compelled to be here, and so I hope it can continue to draw more people like that. And we've had a wealth of instructors just in this last week, so I mean, people are willing to teach. So I hope that more people will be willing to learn.
The options for students now has either been that they have to leave the North in order to obtain their education in the South, and then all of the baggage that carries with it. So alienation from one's community, alienation from one's like cultural foundation, and so on. So hopefully to establish something with a permanent sort of future, we would be able to avoid that.
There's not only just one way of doing things, there's a lot of ways of doing things, and you can work both in holding on to your dinajanya. Also, you can pursue an academic course and live in a balance, live in a balanced lifestyle. I think this course, I hope, presents it in that way. And we need many of these camps all over the place.
I think that everybody should come to Jishita. I think it's just a good place to learn, and it's northern, and it makes me proud to have this type of alternative type of learning space in the Northwest Territories. It's close to home, and it looks like home, and it's very cool.
So that was the first week of being out there. We had 2.5 weeks after there. And as it was a trial run and a big experiment, what sort of came after is sort of the reflections and the aftermath of experiment, and a lot of this was ongoing in terms of process and practices that sort of evolved during the semester, such as sort of nightly circles of people sort of working through and having space to talk about what people were experiencing and what the impact was. To sort of, we had everyone's families out there, and sort of the challenges and the excitement of having lots and lots of kids and lots of people all together trying to make a community.
One of the unanticipated, from an instructor's point of view, issues that we had to develop or had to address, and one that I think we talk about on the next one, I'm not sure, or is gestured to, was given that we took as kind of fundamental to what we were doing what you might call a decolonial approach to developing the pedagogy and so on, was the intensity of the course in terms of it was collapsed into just over 3 weeks. So when you're dealing with issues, and some of the students were dealing with issues for the first time of being able to put a face to some of the experiences that they could see that were problematic in their community. So that face being kind of the sedimented effects of colonialism in their community in the present. So this turned out to be something that as a native instructor who took years to go through in my own educational experience was condensed into 2 weeks for them. So it was totally unanticipated on my behalf, and that was from a lack of foresight, I think, which I take responsibility for, in order to be able to deal with that question. So one of the things that we had to do was reorient or create a space in which students could kind of actually work out, or we could work out those issues collectively. Like now they kind of understood, like there was talk of understanding why, or a student might have been resentful to their parents for not teaching them Dogrib or a well-a dialect of Dogrib because just because they didn't do that in the home, and they felt that as a lack. But kind of contextualizing this as a colonial sort of effect, they were able to place, to see it more clearly, but that had its kind of effects on them emotionally, psychologically, and so on. So I think if this is a pedagogical issue that we're going to have as center, and decolonization have as kind of one of the models or goals to which this type of education is oriented, we have to also incorporate into this program some sort of support for students in those areas. Because it's just entirely unethical from my point of view to kind of draw off of and kind of open some of these issues for the first time and then just kind of depart without having some sort of cultural support network there. So that was one of the unanticipated kind of reflections or experiences that came out of the process that I myself kind of thought was very important.
Another one of the challenges that we faced was in one set of circumstances, we had a professor coming north who had worked in the north extensively but had never worked in a land-based context before. And we had a real clash between the idea of what counted, and this is a challenge that we face bureaucratically when we try to share about Deshinta, and this was very much happened on site, was there was this real wall between the Gwich'in instructor and the professor from Toronto on what counted as class time, and sort of entering into this big conversation about how we needed to really get through printed off PowerPoints, but there was muskrats that needed to be skinned, and we had sort of some funny sort of, clashes in terms of what people's expectations were, despite being involved in and wanting to participate in something that was land-based. When it came down to it, it was like, well, this doesn't count. And having sort of, the response of this is what it's all about. And so really seeing the challenge of people being excited about something versus actually having to rethink how people teach and what counts as teaching, and how do we think about the kind of space we create as professors when we're co-teaching and we're working with other kinds of expertise. And so really having to sort of work together and work through a lot of personal experiences that people felt that were sort of unanticipated, but sort of, I think, hard to avoid when you get a big group of people together and everyone has similar but different ideas. Another interesting sort of impact that we had was that a lot of the support staff on our site were international volunteers through a program called Willing Workers on Organic Farms. So we had all of these sort of German and English and Scottish and a woman from New Zealand who were sort of around and sharing in this sort of experience. And at one point, all of the woofer staff sort of hit this crisis of white guild and colonial responsibility and what were they doing and what was their role. And the students brought them into one of their sharing circles, and sort of having recognized this and having seen this happening in the woofers, created this really beautiful sharing circle of everybody talking about how do you create spaces of support or alliance or community between settlers and Indigenous students, and where is the overlap in going through that process together, and where can there be support, and just sort of creating space. So that was a really interesting student initiative that sort of came out of an unanticipated response of how much emotional sort of reverberations there were to the woofers and different people in the community. So that was sort of an interesting test phase to see. Our next semester is a totally open semester to people from anywhere. So I think it gave us a taste of the kind of interactions that are going to start happening as this community broadens and this process and experiences sort of opened up even further. So coming from the pilot, the goal is to transition into a multi-semester program, going through multiple seasons, so we can do things like hunt the moose that we're going to tan. We can travel more extensively, be moving to different areas and eventually even into different ecosystems. To develop research station capacity. The North, as I'm sure you know, with the International Polar Year, it's a huge hub for researchers from all over the world to come and do research. And really trying to position the idea that community-based research and community people being training other researchers and being trained in doing things like environmental monitoring, boreal ecology, these sorts of things. So trying to develop that, and also the idea of researching what we're doing, very much an action-oriented. We have several students who, after coming to the program, switched their thesis topic at their home universities or started writing term papers on the idea of land-based educational experiences as being informative or transformational. So sort of seeing how we can do research on the actual process of what we're doing to not only evaluate, but to expand sort of the qualitative information that can be out there. And eventually to establish being able to create degrees, interdisciplinary, etc. degrees, and to have control over the site as a community-owned site. Right now it's a private federal land lease, and this area is going through and will eventually go through land claim negotiations. And so to see the actual transition of space into something that's community-owned and focused around education. For anything, money, man, money's tough. And getting money from people like the federal government when you do things like self-determination and you have words like decolonization is a really interesting practice to try to frame why this matters and why it's important. So a lot of this is built in rich partnerships. One of the things that we've been extending to is other universities. So we're currently working with McGill to have Dishinta be a field semester for McGill and trying to arrange faculty arrangements so we can get amazing faculty from leading Canadian universities that one of their courses a year that they have to teach as part of their professorship can actually be at Dishinta, and starting to expand and build partnerships where people are actually committed to this kind of pedagogy and this kind of content, and really serving northern students and serving students that are generally not going to and aren't encouraged to participate in post-secondary. And also co-teaching, getting more people together to talk about this idea of interdisciplinary expertise and really trying to support more of that conversation and more people who teach, professors or elders or otherwise getting together and really figuring out methodologies and ways to support each other through this kind of teaching. So in 2011, pending on money and other things, we're trying to run 3 semesters, offering some master's seminars, and moving towards the idea of not only having undergraduate, but a multi-site land-based master's program and PhD program. And in the world of research, right now we're working on 2 big SSHRC grants, so submitting grants on partnership and partnership development to really sort of establish solid multi-year money and investigations, and sort of moving a lot of these sort of concepts continually off the page into seeing more cohorts of very active students. And a lot of this is propelled by the fact that for the pilot we gave full scholarship to 8 students in total and their children, and we want to continue to be offering Northern scholarships. But since the pilot, we've had, as of yesterday, 32 applications for a next semester that we don't know where it's been, and it hasn't been advertised at all. So it's interesting to see, just sort of by word of mouth. We have, students from, we have one student from Arizona who applied. So we're getting sort of, it's interesting to see how things spread around. Partnerships, University of Alberta, sort of Department of Native Studies has really pushed for this sort of out-of-the-box idea, and sort of done a lot of bureaucratic work to make sure that something like this can happen, because having university credit matters. It gives a lot of legitimacy to things, and it means that students can take this credit and go to university, but also it's a currency to be able to have a semester of university credit. Walter and Duncan Gordon Foundation gave us our core funding and has really pushed the idea that there should be a Northern University. There's currently a conference happening in Yellowknife right now with people from all around the 3 territories around the idea of a Northern University and where it can go from here. Canor, Indigenous Cooperative on the Environment, people that provide faculty, people that provide seeds for the garden and for the greenhouse, people that give in-kind support in terms of, whether it's sending out a quarter of a caribou so that we can make dry meat in class, or are people lending their expertise. So the partnerships are what make this rich and what propel it. And a lot of those partnerships are just simply people giving their time and elders coming out and teaching and sharing.
Yeah, and then there's ongoing, again, negotiations, or not negotiations, it's too formal, but relationships that we're establishing with local First Nations, including my own. Politics is tricky though, so we have lots of support from, like, all of the elders that were involved as instructors were from our communities. A lot of the advisory board, or aspects of the advisory board are where we ensure that there's that input and right to the core. So in terms of curriculum development, other than myself, of course, because for all intents and purposes, I'm located rather permanently down here. So there's also an active sort of ethical consideration of paramount importance when it comes to establishing relationships with Indigenous communities, and those relationships having substance. So right to the core of the decision-making process in terms of curriculum development, scope, vision, and so on. So that's an ongoing process which we take as absolutely central to the success of Diginta.
One of the big articulations from the beginning has been language, and it's really hard to get an Indigenous language credited at a university. So our next semester, what we've done working with, first with the Wellade dialect, is to have a language component within every course. So instead of having a standalone language course, that learning the language and vocabulary and concepts is integrated into every course. So finding really creative ways to make sure that the priorities that have been articulated get actually incorporated into the programming means that a lot of creative things are done. So we end up with these, courses that by all accounts are kind of crazy, but are really exciting in that they transcend a lot of the barriers that are traditionally set up in a course that can be credited and counted. So it's exciting stuff. It sort of ended with a quote by Siku, who is one of the students. The students kept up a blog throughout their whole time on site. You can go, it's on Tumblr. It's Diginta on tumblr.com, and you can see student quotes and videos and music videos they made for final assignments. And just sort of really, I think a lot of this is rooted in the idea that the North is full of experts and people who are teachers despite not having university degrees or not being lawyers or doctors, and that expertise is very, very rich and needs to play a role in sort of the process we're going through. And that's, an ongoing process of decolonization and self-determination that's inclusive of a lot of different kinds of people trying to articulate a vision that's been really strongly articulated for a really long time. So these are sort of little steps in a bigger project, whether it's a multi-site university or part of sort of the bigger questions. But I don't know. I think we'll just kind of open it up to talking and make this conversation bigger with all of you, and see what it spiked and what you guys have to say. But Messi, it's really exciting to be here and nice to present with Glenn.
I can't really tell the picture. Is that my uncle? I see.
The music in the beginning, who was that?
Stephen Kelsey.
I was just there was a brief comment on diamond polishing. I think it was maybe said in jest. I was wondering, is there some degree of pressure on, to get funding and to kind of build relationships with researchers, and that you have to have more kind of applied elements and things related to economics around your curriculum?
Well, I think There's a big challenge in terms of funding, of trying to articulate, for example, why something like this can lead to economic development. Like the plain nuts and bolts of, okay, if we had a university, how many jobs would it create and what kind of jobs would those be? And there's definitely a lot of, I think, pressure generally is that most of the money that's available for partnerships in education is around mining. And sort of that, you know, one of the topic areas that keeps coming up is sustainable mining and business, or, you know, geology. We're in a really rich rare earth mineral geographic deposit that has one of, you know, the biggest deposits in the world, and there's a rare earth mineral mine, you know, coming online very close. So there's a lot of that sort of, you know, you should be positioning yourself as you know, being more industry oriented, because industry is where the money is. But that's always, you know, if that's the case and you keep going that route, then you don't have, you know, as many lawyers or as many, you know, people. If you have self-government, then who's staffing the self-government?
Also, one of the main kind of where the industry hasn't been totally forthright in their planning of kind of the direction of their economic development initiatives has been in sustainability of jobs over time and what those jobs are. So that has tended to be overwhelmingly that of labor in the construction phase. And you see locals, particularly Dene or Aboriginal locals, not filtering up the chain at all that successfully. So therefore that job is quite dependent on at a very low level of the hierarchy, the specific sort of orientation to the industry. What the Chinta does though, or like what a possibility of it is, and I know that this was in conversation, is like there's a whole network of other industry research type jobs that just the character of that type of industry demands. So one of them is that they're opening a mine not too far away from the site on Yellowknives Dene territory, and part of the thing that we might be able to offer as a course would be to be training people in terms of environmental assessment as a sort of group that is involved in those sorts of things. So even if some, like myself, might be quite critical of development, I'm also quite, I recognize that there's an important, a whole other field of research and occupations that are required in order to ensure that what's going on is going on with respect to local interest, Indigenous or otherwise, which is monitored appropriately and critically. So an education like program like the Chinta, which involves these sorts of land-based activities, could inform that industry, which would amount to an education model that is, by definition, more self-determining than one that bottlenecks you into a certain sector of the economy.
My question was about the age of the participants. It seemed like they were in their late teens, but it seems like the material could actually be taught at even a younger age. And my thoughts on what age would be appropriate for this program.
The students were 18 to 32 in terms of age range. So we had, and a very much diversity in where they're at in their education. So we had 2 boys who were just graduated high school, and one of them brought their daughter, and up to a Yellowknife-born Nicaraguan Mayan who's doing his master's in polar law, and sort of everything in between. So a real range of learners, and it was very much, in this first cohort, was trying to get a lot of adult learners, which is sort of, especially when people are already in jobs, getting educational leave is sort of a challenge. We had people apply and not granted leave from work who are in their 40s and 50s. So a real range, and part of sort of the nice thing about the atmosphere is that you can teach to a lot of different levels because there's sort of, you know, space outside where you can have conversations with your professors, or you're going out and doing things with the different instructors. So there's a lot of opportunity to learn at the level that you're at, and also in terms of people who have different learning styles. That's one of the things we're seeing is people applying who are immediately saying in their applications, like, I'm heavily dyslexic and have trouble reading, but I do a lot of performance in music, and trying to figure out ways to evaluate and ensure that there's support for students, and finding, is there space, where's the space beyond the essay? Where's the space beyond testing for assessment? And so some of these real sort of nuts and bolts challenges for the diversity of people that are interested in the diversity of that people came. So.
While also recognizing the importance of developing communication and writing skills, because again, if you're like modeling it on self-determination, it doesn't serve anybody's purpose to kind of inflate student expectations and then send them out to be, they now think that they're armed in order to approach a degree program at the U of A or here at UBC or whatever. So it's kind of really trying to give them to arm them in all of these aspects while maintaining an inclusivity or a non-exclusive sort of approach to education. On the age, I think you're right, and that's kind of like next week I'll be I'm trying to adapt the course that I did for a more high school oriented 9 through 12 student base in Ballantyne, even further north than on Saatu territory, and I think that it's time for that too, because the curriculum is radically deficient in terms of Dene political history and all these things. And I teach it I'm like, this isn't just important for you. This is like one of the most innovative models of kind of, and like contemporary, institutionally rich and doable. It had its problems, but out of any sort of proposal for self-determination in the settler or the Anglo-Commonwealth. So it's not just and there's a cathartic aspect to that claiming ownership over that, but there's also this is we had a good kick at a solution here. It's just lost. So that needs to be instilled in students at a very, very young age before the flashy red truck gets its claws into people and they don't care about finishing high school. Like I have a lot of cousins who once 16 kicks, they're looking at their way out of high school, not finishing in order to land what seems in the short term a lucrative position in the mines.
And most of the, Cindy first, but most of the curriculum in the North is Alberta curriculum, especially when you get into high school, and there's a Northern Studies course. But they just did a big evaluation of Northern Studies and sort of what are the opportunities in Northern Studies. But someone like myself, I went to the Catholic high school in Yellowknife and sat around with sort of people from Delo and Dead, and we made teepees out of toothpicks, and our teacher was from Newfoundland. And very often you see Northern Studies being given to the newest teacher off the plane. And so you end up in these ridiculous contexts. Like when I lived in Fort Good Hope doing my PhD research, taking over Northern Studies, and they hadn't had any guest speakers in all year, and you're living in a community with Frank Tiselli and all of these luminary thinkers, and you're not bringing them into the classroom. So sort of one of the things they're doing now in ECNE is they want to develop a high school curriculum that's grade 10 through graduation, Northern Studies that's seen as equivalent to Social Studies 10, 20, 30, and is recognized by universities as being equivalent. So that's one of the things that we're working with ECNE is how do we create a seamless curriculum so that people can go through 10, 11, 12, and into university where these concepts, it's not the first time they hear them, but it's something that they've been learning about and introduced to as they go through school. So there's really exciting things that are, that are going on and that are possible, and a lot of people that are, thinking in sort of similar ways, or different ways, but complementary. So.
And important to a point that Aaron brought up, where culture no longer is a supplemental aspect to the education process, but one that is fundamentally informative of it. So you cannot disassociate culture as something that happens out there, away from what you're doing in the classroom otherwise. So that's one of the even where now there's a there's a model that kind of back to the land sort of programs for students in high school and grade school that still takes as like something that is external to what you do in school. So what we've tried to do in this program is to entirely integrate the two, where culture is not something that can be separated from questions of political economy, questions of governance or whatever, but it is internal to all of those discussions. And I think that is quite different than the culture as add-on model that Northern Studies or whatever tends to adhere to curriculum-wise in the North.
And it's also in the atmosphere of everybody brought their kids, and so any given day there would be kids sitting around and listening, and we were doing things, packing our kids. And so the kids would go off sometime and do things like in the kids zone and, you know, go out in the boats or go canoeing or go collect plants. But the kids were around. They weren't separated. It wasn't like, oh, we're shutting the door and now we're in theoretical classroom time. They're being exposed to that, you know, and they're, you know, 18 months to 8 years old. And, you know, kind of things that when you know, somebody put on a DVD on the laptop and it was Peter Pan. And then it was like, all right, let's have a discussion about Peter Pan with all the kids. So you create these sort of teachable moments because we're not segregated and the old people aren't in a home. Everybody's sitting around, you know, eating and cooking and being together. And that was so much of what was rich about it, was that we were taking things we were thinking about theoretically and we were, you know, working them out in the day-to-day, you know, doing each other's laundry, like taking each other's kids so that the moms could go have a sauna. And so these things become very practical concerns because you're back living in community. And one of the great comments from, you know, one of the German volunteers, like weekend, he goes, I don't even know whose kids are whose. And it was like, exactly. And that's sort of, you know, that's a beautiful thing. So it's not just about credits, it's about family. And I think that that's something that, you know, you did well on.
So how does that relate to some of the other kinds of things that actually, I mean, for example, how you create teacher training opportunities so you're not dependent on teachers from Newfoundland, or doctors coming from the South, or lawyers? I mean, is that separate and distinct from this land-based community? Or is there a way in which it's intended that some of it will be integrated so that you're not dependent on their spending $2,000 to come up and check people's assets?
I think it's totally integrative. It's that you're supporting people who not only want to do these things, but feel like they're resourced and have the mentorship and support that they can. And a way of doing it so that they're getting, if people want to go to medical school, that they could do so having had a background that situates them to succeed. So I think that something like this is part of the project of really having a cohort of, you know, we're talking about devolution, which you've seen lots in the news lately, but really, you know, taking back the reins. And I think something like this is that it's about building strong people, and if you have strong people and stronger communities, then that's going to start happening more and more. And you're starting to see it already, is that we have a lot more people, you know, going to law school, going to medical school, and people come home when they're done. And so there's a lot more examples of that too. Cindy?
Yeah, just curious about a typical day. So, because it's 24 hours in sunlight up there, so I don't expect the school would be 24 hours. So just curious if you could just kind of block out the day.
We would start, like I'll just give a rundown of our day. So we would start with one of the things that it kind of places demand on instructors, especially ones from institutions or institutionalized, I guess, like myself, was an openness and kind of always cognizant of how you're going to, and the things that would come up in your interaction with your co-teachers, in particular elders. So I often found myself more as a facilitator than anything. So I would see what I thought was an opportunity where I could like recognize my ignorance and then turn it over to an elder on a question of governance or decision making sort of thing. So that's kind of always was there. So there was never, or there was very rarely any just like point blank course kind of, we're going to sit around with our pads and make notes and so on. Or we really kind of kept that down. And just being able to be outside for it was very conducive of that, because the elders were very rarely inside for that sort of, when it did that sort of thing. Afternoons were usually more explicitly oriented towards land-based activities and just kind of the self-sustaining aspect of being out there for the length that we were. So we would set traps, we would dry and smoke fish, we would prepare dry meat, learn about traditional plant use, learn how to set deadfall traps, like all these sorts of things. That was a crash course in the ethics of reciprocity that those activities kind of emphasize. But again, that didn't end there, because in the evening it became, because these people are also writing essays, they're reading and so forth. So in terms of instructors and student relationships, dinner would never end. After supper, it would never end. It was this ongoing sort of dialogue between myself, students, other instructors, elders, and so on. So it was like, that was part of the thing that added to the intensity of it too, which I think we kind of didn't anticipate, was that there wasn't any escaping this. So whereas if, like, these things are having an effect on you, you're kind of learning about the effects of colonialism on your community. These things might seem kind of pretty formidable at times, but you're also thinking about alternatives. There was no, like, going to the bar. There was no
going home, leaving.
So those are things that we have to anticipate to even make it more actually involved, where you could, like, the space outside of that sort of learning experience was another sort of network of cultural support that they could latch into. And then similarly with Steph. Steph would weave in she's like been a negotiator for some time for self-government, and it would weave into their preparing for smoking and tanning hides and so on. So it didn't end.
You know, it's sort of, you get up in the morning and people would be sort of like out checking nets, and some people would be helping with breakfast or getting kids ready. You know, people would be like down writing essays or like on Facebook. There was a really, amazing to see the discussions that were started on Facebook by people writing home and seeing what they're doing and people writing back. And, and going down to the fire, having some sort of discussion led. We had lots of guest speakers come in. And sort of moving from, sitting and talking about negotiations and then being like, all right, like, let's go twist some hides and talk about, what role patience plays in the process we're talking about. So, very hands-on, and also a lot of taking care of what people, needed, whether it was like kids or elders or story time. So a lot of sort of figuring out who can do what so that other people can do certain things. So a lot of, figuring out the division of labor. And then you do things like, you'd go to the sauna and there'd be like 3 people in the sauna, like, hatching out Chiaki Alfred. And like, so it was sort of like all of these zones going on everywhere. And you'd see people, like a lot of people going, on nightly walks, nightly hikes, especially before or after the sort of the intense circle where people were doing a lot of the, how am I feeling? And, people saying enough of talking about how we're feeling, like I'm gonna go for a walk. So opportunity of being out there, having just lots of different spaces so that people could, go and make space in the cabin or go and, canoe or go for a fish. But the intensity of it was something that was really tough because people, like, we came to the end of 3.5 weeks and we did 4 days out camping and doing feasts for the health promotion course on National Aboriginal Day. We had John Bizot come out and, teach us songs and do Twitcho cosmology, and we had sort of all of these. It was so intense, and so it was really, at the end when people came back to town, you saw this really interesting shift of people really drawing on the people they had chosen to be their mentors. So the mentors getting a lot of calls, but a lot of students getting together. And that's something that's really interesting, that we're now several months down the road, and the students that live in Yellowknife are still getting together regularly and have formed this really amazing social group of friends to support. They're reading new books, and I think the last one they did was wretched of the earth, and so they're reading books and sharing things. They have a sewing circle, some of the ladies, so their relationships have continued beyond the space, and that's been something that's really exciting, is to see where people take it from.
Of course, that was totally intense. Like, I don't think I could handle it. I had like 12 hours of school, I put that hard. So, do you think that if it was longer or a whole semester, that maybe that essentially would, spread out a bit more? That people, I can't imagine like the whole thing, I guess, being, I guess just it's just like such a version that I would think that it would just be a lot on someone.
And it was a lot on someone, so that's why it's like very important to be able to provide the support for that, given of what we're talking about too. But I don't also mean to make it sound like it was never ending. Like, it was quite fun. Like on National and Aboriginal Day, I wasn't there, but I heard there was a fashion show and like a traditional fashion show, and all these sorts of things that made it more than just hitting the books or out there like checking traps all the time and stuff like that. But even that, for these students, one of the reoccurring themes was like, I can't believe that I had to come to here, in a kind of a sad sense, to be able to learn how to dry fish, sort of thing. So even though it's work and difficult work, it was also very, very like profoundly rewarding for myself and for others and for other students to be able to, like, wow, I'm doing this, and that's good. So it wasn't like, it was intense, but it was also, as the video demonstrated, like very cathartic and rewarding for students as well. What we just have to do is be able to organize it slightly, or like this was an experiment, so we knew, or we now have a good sense of what didn't work. Like, we have to get readings to them prior to the site time in order for them to not be bogged down with having to struggle through reading and writing as much when we're trying to do the in-class and online stuff. But all of that, again, requires more certainty in terms of when money's coming and not being like, are we on the go, are we not on the go, sort of thing. Okay, we can do it, so call them all up again and it's next week, sort of thing. So.
Mm-hmm. One of the things we've done in the design for next time, based on sort of students and faculty input, is that it'll be a 12-week semester where you have 4 weeks of sort of prep and reading and support through group support if you're in your community, or over the phone or on the internet, and then you come on site for 5 to 6 weeks, and then have a 2-week period after where people are sort of sort of digesting and getting final papers done. So really sort of extending the length of time that people have, because the biggest thing at the end was people were exhausted. They're like, it was way too short. So.
You've got this one seminar, one term, I suppose, when you extend it. And is the idea that after that, that's a building block and then people go away? Or is the plan to build more and more blocks onto it, but up there?
Yeah, it's sort of, in the end to have a whole degree, but it's sort of both. So for next term we're looking at offering all of the courses we had previously at both a 200 and an upper level for undergraduate, and also incorporating two master's seminars, so that people, because there's a lot of people that want to come back, and also people who are in the middle of degrees who want to be coming in. So offering basically multi-level courses so that it can support people coming from multiple semesters, and also having different offerings. We have negotiations next term, boreal ecology, this sort of thing. So expanding the course offerings so people have more choice. But also that people can transfer if they want to go to we have one student who's planning on going to U of A and has applied for next September to be at U of A in Native Studies. So also ensuring that if people do want to be transitioning, that they have the support. So the student that was wanting to go to U of A was hooking them up with sort of the northern coordinator, and making sure that there is continued support for them when they're there, because that's a big thing when people go south to school, is depending on how you position yourself, it can be hard to be resourced.
My name is Curtis. It's interesting, your presentation. I thought it was very good. I wasn't sure what was going to be on tonight. I just know that it's free lectures here tonight, so I could show up. So it was actually quite a treat that what you presented. I'm actually doing the same thing back home in northern British Columbia, and I live in Vancouver now because I work here. But so I've learned quite a bit on what you're doing with your program. And it sounds to me, I don't know, am I picking this up right? Is the decolonization, is it part of a consequence of the conversation and the learning that's going on there? Or is it kind of like a planned outcome that you were looking at? And how does that fit in? How does leadership fit into your program?
That's an interesting question, because one of the first times that I went back, like I usually go back just as kind of family member or community member, but one of the first times I went back in the capacity as as an expert on anything was for this policy conference that happened last year. And that's what my work does. It focuses on kind of questions of colonialism and decolonization, but also my own process of learning what our communities had to offer that. So I was in this position where I'm giving this kind of paper or talk or whatever to a diversity of people, from like stuffy bureaucrats to elders who were part of the movement in the 70s that I was talking about. And I gave the talk and I was like, okay, there's these few people in this room which I would be very hurt or upset with myself if they didn't agree with what I was saying, and bringing to the fore questions of ongoing colonialism in the North and their effects on our communities. And one of them was George Barnaby, which I, like I said, like a philosopher king of the Northwest Territories. And I was like, as long as he agrees with me. And after I talked, he got up and he was like, why haven't we been talking about, like, we stopped talking about colonialism and its effects? And he's a prominent, like, leader. And I haven't heard anybody talk about colonialism like this in quite a while. So that was my, like, leadership is there. They're supportive of it, but it just somehow kind of left the dominant discourse in the North, where it used to be fundamentally central to our understandings of development, our critiques, and our understanding of an alternative. So this, I thought, kind of gave, I felt more confident in being able to pursue something like that in an educational context, precisely because it had supportive leadership. Other leadership gave me the stink eye, but like I knew that it was there still, and people still wanted to talk about that, and they could like look at their own contributions to it historically and whatnot. So, and students were very receptive to it. They like, you could literally see some of them. Like there was one of the students, he was like, we're reading some texts or whatever about decolonization or the way in which colonization has affected us as Indigenous people. And he's like, like this is the first day. He's like, this is just irrelevant to my community. We're not colonized, or this isn't a problem up here. By the end of the week, he was like, he was really started to get a sense of what had been so normalized in terms of community behavior or whatever, and being, I get, like, it was quite jarring to him. And so it also had, or gave students a conceptual and practical vocabulary to kind of, to get a better sense of what they see or experience every day in their communities.
Do you have any leadership built into your curriculum, your program right now?
We've had well, again, this is kind of more of a structural sort of issue. We had lots of people who were willing to and would come out. So Francois Paulette is a central, or has been a central leader in the North for years, since the heyday of the Indian Brotherhood in the 60s and 70s. George Barnaby really wanted to come co-teach with me on these questions. Steve Cackby was going to come out, and Bill Erasmus was going to come out. Joanne Barnaby did come out, who is a very strong Dene woman in the Northwest Territory who has done work historically with the Dene Nation and then contemporary times and around Indigenous knowledge and stuff like that. So a lot of people were involved with it and had agreed to participate, but given the constraints, I think institutionally, in terms of when money's going to come and so on, it didn't tend to overlap with that one pilot. But we have, like George wants to come work again was really kind of upset that he didn't get to come do it, and he will be involved in the next one.
You're also talking about leadership and the idea of training leaders, like explicitly the idea of leadership training, is that what?
The program that I developed back home is specifically geared to develop leaders, because I think the existing school system right now is not designed to develop leaders. I think you mentioned used the word wage slave. I mean, essentially, all this school system today is doing is developing people to work for other people. They're not developing people to become leaders. They don't want a society full of leaders, let's put it that way. And I think that's the fundamental problem that inherent in the education system today. So what I wanted to do is develop an experience for youth to become leaders.
Well, and I think that's sort of the thing that a land-based context does, is that everyone has a space to be the leader. There was some people that were really awesome at cutting firewood, and other people who had never done it, or netting fish. So everyone had a space where it was their turn to kind of lead the group. And I think that's where sort of multidimensional, learning spaces, you don't explicitly say, this is how we're going to train you to be a leader, but through example and mentorship and opportunity, everybody gets a chance to be stronger in themselves and to be stronger in how they participate in community. So I think that leadership is an inevitable outcome of the kind of content and the kind of process.
The day-to-day activities, people will
maybe.
Students explicitly saw that as being a responsibility of theirs, because they're now dealing with kind of, there's these problems in our communities and they have these historical and contemporary foundations, and it is our responsibility. So George in that one where he's like, we're going to learn to take the reins, to paddle the canoe sort of thing. That was a reoccurring sort of that's what they were there for too. And I think that the courses delivered in that, and both practical and in more broader, in a more broader sense as well. And I think the students saw that as also.
And I think it's a matter of people having an understanding of a definition of a leader can take so many different forms. Mm-hmm. It doesn't mean somebody having a C on their jersey, and there's different types of leaders on the team, right? So people got to, if people are explaining that and put it into that kind of a context, then they'll understand that they have their own role in their family, in their community, in their society. And within that role and where their expertise is, they'll take on that leadership responsibility.
Yeah, and I think that's sort of an atmosphere where it's like nobody's telling you what to do, but you're all talking about what you could do and what you should do and how you can do it together.
But I think your program is very innovative, and I think it's the future.
It's always hard to know when to take a break to separate between the formal part of the discussion and the conversations you may want to continue afterwards. They've been working pretty hard for a little while, and I'm sure this has been one of the most interesting question periods in one of these lectures, and I think it's both the interest in the topic and the kind of experiment that you're involved in and the clarity with which you gave us a chance to understand it. So in a minute, I'm going to ask everyone to join me in thanking you. But first, I want to make just a couple of other little observations. And one of them is that I think we're incredibly fortunate to have people from here and from UBC working in this context, because not only does it work to develop something unique in the north, in the, on the land, in that the development of that institutional setting. But your experience with that kind of projects is something that you've brought here, and it can inform our work here as well. Because we are, of course, on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of Coast Salish people, and this is the land here. And there are communities with which we can work, and in which we can perhaps take some of the really innovative things that you are developing in that context and apply it to our own work. And just one other comment on mainstream education and leadership. Of course, this educational system that we're all involved in many locations, trains people to work for other people. There are some institutions within mainstream educational systems, which of course are designed specifically to train the leadership. And UBC, in at least some places, is possibly even one of them. But I think what this investigation helps to understand, in your comments as well, point to is the ways in which leaders lead institutions, but they're also defined by them, and how a society chooses to think about its process and the tools that it has to think about them defines the direction it takes and what it takes to help move in that direction, and the roles that many people can play in that. And that's a really important process, defining that and giving people a way to see it clearly and to see how to establish a direction, and then what tools are necessary to develop through their institutions to enable them to do that. So it's a really complex question, but this is a really interesting experiment. You've given us a chance to see in how a community can develop that. And that's, again, a lesson that we can all take into our contexts and work with to try to do the best job we can in helping us all develop good ways to think and move. So please join me in thanking our two presenters tonight.